It's time to nap in a king-size bed in Unit 10A, Inner Chamber. Frankly, I don't know why this is a separate map from the final showdown. This actually feels a lot shorter than the 2 pumping stations I was going to put together. It's pretty much just a short trek with chasing Macron. It sort of reminds me of the penultimate map on Rise of the Triad and only has a couple Iron Maidens and a few flyers. Hopping on stretching platforms and navigating around some lasers really don't do much to make this map feel like it has enough going for it, to be honest. It doesn't even have any secrets. I don't get why chasing the main baddie has to mean such a dissatisfyingly short and linear map. I'd say this is overall the worst map in Quake 2 just because of the complete lack of anything that it really has going for it. It's time to dig for gold in Unit 4D Drilling Area. I'll be honest, this map is fairly underwhelming despite having 3 different paths and an alternate route for the first based on a previous secret. The drill laser looks really cool, no doubt, but all 3 of these paths are very short and also very linear, so there really isn't much here apart from maybe 2 crusher ceilings. Add onto that a solution that isn't well telegraphed to the player in the form of random rods you have to destroy to open a mandatory path, and it just leaves a sour taste in my mouth. No interesting new mechanics either. It's the same gunners, tanks, gladiators, and what have you that you've seen before. It's not an especially terrible map, mind you, but it's probably the most forgettable map in the game, and I don't really have any pleasant memories of it. It's time to go down, down, down into Unit 4E, Lower Mines. It's another map that has some neat set-piece gimmicks, but the map itself is straight-lined and way too lacking substance for my liking. I'll give it some slight credit though. It has some interesting things like a trap in the floor and a runaway drill that you have to avoid being minced by down a long hall. Other than that, it's mostly just gunners and technicians and not really much else to speak of save for a cool laser sequence. Unlike many other linear maps, it doesn't even have any secrets to remotely encourage you to really poke around other than maybe one drop-off spot. Still not a terrible map by any means, but it's very lackluster and disappointing. Very much comes across as a filler in between. It's time to fill our pockets with hot lead in Unit 2A, Ammo Depot. Notably, it introduces the melee rushing berserkers and the rapid fire flying technicians in addition to the beefy chain gun if you can find the secret for it. On the positive side, it's a pretty meaty map that even takes advantage of the polygonal nature of the game by having different height elevation halls you'll end up on to experience maps in different perspectives. On the negative side, you guessed it, this map is fairly on the linear side outside of a few secrets, so it feels a bit too much of a straight line for my liking. However, that isn't too much of a detriment. The map is still fairly fun to play through due to the sheer scale. Ultimately, it's a path I'd have liked to see more diverting paths and exploratory paths on, but that doesn't hurt the overall experience. It's time to live among the boxes in Unit 2C, Warehouse. Let's just get this out of the way. The map is aggressively linear and even performs the sin of an unexpected point of no return, things I made it no secret I dislike. On an upside, it introduces the slow but hard-hitting and heavily armored tank. This guy's a real beast and even has a rocket launcher, so definitely don't want to take them lightly. The main gimmick of this map is basically taking the power cubes you grabbed in the last map and slamming them into circuits to power up the warehouse and then escaping via a conveyor belt alongside boxes. It has some cool moments like lowering stairs or blowing open a door, but ultimately the map is too straight line for my liking and parasites are just plain annoying. It's time to wallow in the skin burns in Unit 6D, Toxic Waste Dump. This is another map that feels like it was made more as an in-between to get to the pumping stations, so it doesn't really feel that special as a result. To the map's slight credit, there's an optional trek through a pipe of toxic waste to get some extra goodies and a secret, but that's about all it's got going for it. It has a bit extra after the pumping stations, including a BFG if you didn't already have one, but just a way to get back to the main path to get back to the reactor. The map was pretty much just made to get you to the next map your objective is at, and it kinda shows. While it's still engaging with the enemies, the map itself leaves something to be desired and could have stood to have some more diverting paths. It's time for a swim in Unit 6E, Pumping Station 1. For the most part, it looks like this is another linear to the objective map, which I'll have to get used to since it seems to be the norm more often than not. That being said, there's at least an interesting destructible pipe that has a secret waterway ending up in a red-lit courtyard with flyers and a secret quad damage. It's actually short enough that I considered lumping it in with Pumping Station 2, but it's not the shortest map, so I figured I'll just judge them as separate entities. The aesthetic is alright and just varied enough that it doesn't feel too generic if nothing else. Ultimately, still a fun map to engage with the enemies in, but it could have been a bit larger and a bit more varied in branching paths and not just being mostly a straight line. It's time for factory-produced name sludge in Unit 6F, Pumping Station 2. Perhaps the kindest thing I can say about it is it's a better map than the first pumping station, enough that I can say it deserves to be its own map. You get to the actual pump fast enough, but then you have to find a blue key and go along that line to actually reach the exit. It feels like there's more there, and there's a sense of scale. That being said, the map is still on the linear side of the equation, though it has a few secrets to at least reward you for exploring. At least it has some length though, so my impression of it is overall positive. Even though it's fairly straight-lined, it has enough to offer that I can definitely say it's the better of the two and reasonably decent on its own terms. It's time to roll up your windows for Unit 8F, Outlands. This is yet another map that's more interesting for its objective than for the map because for the most part it's a cavern full of hit scanner machine gun troops. The only real diverging path is if you jump down into the waters below where you have to fight off piranha fish instead to get to the airstrike marker you need to find. Now obviously calling down an airstrike is fairly cool and actually looks pretty satisfying for the standards of id Tech 2. Too bad the rest of the map just doesn't seem that special. I wouldn't even say it's the most engaging since dealing with so many hit scanners isn't something I'm a fan of. Mostly style and pretty lacking in substance, this map is mostly fun to make airplanes blow something up at the end, not so much playing through. It's time for Big Guns in Unit 7A, Big Gun. For a map that has the name of Big Gun, this one's actually disappointingly small with only a boss and a few enemies scattered in a hallway without even a single secret to speak of. The Hornet is pretty cool as a boss, but it's essentially a gunner mixed with an Icarus, so it doesn't exactly have anything too special. It can go down without too much difficulty. The evacuation scene with an invisible timer where you can get killed was pretty annoying, especially if you left some enemies alive and you're scrambling to get to the escape pod. I get that it's a boss map, but it'd be nice to have more to it so it can stand on its own way. It's ultimately just another boss map that's clearly built around the boss and little else, disappointing for a map named Big Gun since you expect a little more heft. It's time to face Monty in UnitXB, the Reactor. This is another case of a map that has a pretty cool design but is just too linear for me personally, only even has a single secret. Now mind you, it does have some pretty cool concepts. The RTX version actually helps it by making the room with the opening skyline really dark until it opens up and lets light through. The alternating lasers right before that though is kind of annoying since it kind of forces you to either wait or crawl if you don't want to eat some damage, slowing you down. This is also another map that acts as a bit of a HUD since there's 3 different maps you need to go through it to access, and it's cool how there are changes each time. Ultimately, it's all style and basically no substance, straight lines back and forth, and no innovatively good gameplay mechanics, honestly. It's time to watch out for explosions in Unit 4A, Mine Entrance. This is another relatively straight-lined map, though, with a couple of optional unofficial secrets in addition to an actual secret introducing the rocket launcher. There's a pretty good theme with a mix of caverns and lava with a kind of tech that would be used for mining operations with some water at the end for good measure. It's filled with the usual berserkers, grunts, flyers, and Icarus that you'd expect, and is lacking the truly hard hitters like gunners and tanks, so it's on the easy side for this late in so long as you watch your step. Gameplay-wise, it leaves something to be desired, but it's an entrance, so perhaps it's not meant to be especially deep anyway, and at least it doesn't overstay its welcome. It's time for a relaxing cold shower in Unit 6C Cooling Facility. Yep, this is yet another map that's more or less in a straight line, though this one has more secrets going for it at least. One nice one is if you go back to it after destroying the reactor, there's a reference to Dopefish, which has become id tradition to some degree. The main gimmick of the map is going around in water-filled pipes to shut down the cooling system so you can take out the reactor. It's pretty comparable to the processing plant, except less interesting in its visual design since you're just going through a circuit and ending up back where you started from. Ultimately, it's another map that's kind of lackluster and has a few annoying moments, but at least it has some interesting additions too and is hardly the worst. It's time to take cover and hide in Unit 4C, Borehole. This is mostly a pretty basic water cavern, though the elevator platform above lava is visually and mechanically interesting since it has 3 floors to go through. The map is mostly straightforward, though has a pretty beefy optional area should you drop down, so it's not like it's straight linear. Pretty typical cast of enemies with gladiators, gunners, berserkers, mutants, and machine gun grunts all to rain down hell on you. One interesting thing at least is there's a sort of secret area with a secret exit, not to a unique map, but it does give you a vantage point in the next map. When you get down to it, it's another map alright, which is to say it's alright, not too great, nor is it particularly bad either. It's time to find a cure for railgun burns in Unit 8C, Research Lab. I'd honestly compare it to Processing Plant in that it delves into the tech and torture aspect of the Strogg in an interesting way, but it's also very linear and also just full of parasites. The concept of grabbing a cybernetic head to serve as a key is pretty cool, but it was also a thing in Duke Nukem 0 Hour, and I'd definitely say it had the much better map to go with it. Having elevators without external buttons is also slightly annoying, since it means you might have long shafts potentially leading to fall damage if you don't want to go around. The best thing I can say about it is the parasites and Iron Maidens can give the map a bit of difficulty if they catch you off guard. Apart from that, the map just feels too shallow to really do the tech lab aesthetic much justice in terms of actual gameplay. It's time for a healthy green glow in UnitXA Power Plant. This map isn't the most open out there, but it does get some bonus points for having the BF Mother Lovin' G and a secret that's not hard to find. It also introduces Iron Maidens, who I kind of get enjoyment out of knocking down with a railgun right as they're about to unleash their attack. Seems the super tank also took a bit of a downgrade because he's just chilling at the very beginning for you to take out to get to a key. One section is a little tricky, explosions coming out of a vent, and you have to time it just right to avoid taking some serious damage. Ultimately, it's a pretty straight-lined map, but at least it offers one hell of a compensation weapon in addition to an interesting new enemy type. It's time to fight the system, man, in Unit 3C, Security Complex. This is certainly the most hub map yet, in that you'll be going back to this map a good few times going into other areas. For this reason, the map itself doesn't feel too special, though it does have the Flying Icarus enemy on at least one of those visits. Another thing to note is that it's technically the first map to give you access to the grenade launcher via a secret, so that's pretty nice. There really isn't too much else to say about the map though. It's not bad by any means, but you can tell it was made with the purpose of connecting other more interesting maps together. Ultimately, it fulfills what it needs to, but it's a pretty standard map when you get down to it, not having too much to stand on by itself. It's time to refine some Gibbs in Unit 5B Processing Plant. It's certainly immersive because, like the prisoners, you're led along a conveyor belt with the enemies in the map serving as the various grinders. It's an interesting concept, shutting off the strogification process, and it's certainly the best part of Strogs, but the map is so aggressively linear, only a few secrets to provide any branching paths. I think it's safe to say it's more of a story map. It's there for the plot of the Strogs transforming their prisoners, and you have to stop them. I just wish there was more to it, because it seems as though beyond the cool set pieces, it's pretty instantly forgettable. Ultimately, the premise and visuals are among the best in Quake 2, but gameplay reigns supreme, and it's pretty lacking there in my opinion. It's time for a new dimension of pain in Unit 3D, Torture Chambers. Basically, it expands on the prisons, and you have to infiltrate 2 cell blocks to get through it and get the security key you need. One plus is it isn't just a prison, there's also an upper area where you have to fight a tank and can find a hyperblaster before descending into the location. Probably the most noteworthy part is you can choose to lower a caged prisoner into lava, which you have to do to get a hyperblaster. It also makes good use of verticality, even if it's a bit cramped and linear for my liking, so it's nice to see the map from different angles and dropping into the waterways to find the way. Ultimately, it's a competent map with a decent theme, but it's not the most exciting in terms of gameplay, functional rather than especially flashy. It's time to get really fancy in Unit 9C, Upper Palace. This map isn't nearly as interesting as what was before it, despite technically interacting with the previous map via the data disk. Destroying the communication laser was pretty cool, but apart from that, it's just the usual fray of tank commanders, Iron Maidens, gunners, and what have you to get through to the exit. There's one impressively tall room leading into the communication laser, but that's about the only other thing it has distinguishing itself. I won't be too harsh on the map, it's about as good as most of Quake 2's maps, but it's a shame. As is, it's mostly an average map with a cool hub connection and a cool explosion when you do your objective, but that's about it. It's time to ascend to Unit 4B, Upper Mines. This is another straight-lined map, but gunners, gladiators, and mutants are back for anyone who really missed getting ripped apart by them. Perhaps the most unique part of the map is launchers firing explosions at you through a hall to get the first non-secret rocket launcher in the game, for what that's worth. The goal is to get ventilation working to access the lower mines, and you can't get into the exit until you complete this task. One upside at least is the use of outdoor areas and moving parts in select places, which look especially nice on Quake 2 RTX. Ultimately, it's another alright map that I feel is just a bit too linear and even a little cheap for my liking, although you get an optional path leading back after the ventilation, so there's that. It's time to go from Audi to Any in Unit 8D, Inner Hangar. So on the positive side, it's a fairly beefy map, but on the negative side, it's also on the linear side without too much deviation other than a few secrets. The water sections provide a nice change of aesthetic, and at least the Hornet is put to much better use here than when he first appeared, and many of the areas provide a nice big sense of scale. The water block section with the water, though, is a little irritating trying to get lined up properly since they seem to move at different speeds, which can make it hard to jump across. Ultimately, though, it's still a pretty good map with some good visual design like spinning cogs. I just wish there was more deviations and paths or maybe larger optional areas so it doesn't feel so much like it's a straight line. It's time to pencil people into Unit 5A, Receiving Center. While it's still kind of on the linear side, it's substantially more interesting than the previous two maps, providing plenty of length. It even has secrets, notably one over a waterfall into a very unique secret map and another one granting you the railgun, the very powerful laser rifle of the gladiators. The idea of the map is you're supposed to drain some lava to get through, though I actually cheekily got past it with some select jumping. This is another hub-like map that you'll be returning to, though only really once, so it doesn't wear out its welcome. Overall, it's a vast improvement over what came before it, and I'd even consider it a good map overall with decent variety too. It's time to get crisscross in Unit 3F, Grid Control. This may be the most cramped and straightforward map yet, but it's a boss map introducing the super tank, so perhaps it can be forgiven a bit. So far, this is the one map that has by far the biggest impact going to the RTX version because all those dull metal panels become full-on mirrors with reflections all over the place. The super tank is certainly nothing to scoff at, and the lasers to dodge as well as the destructible objective makes for unique additions. It's only a shame that the map has so little going for it. It doesn't even have any secrets, but it has more than just a boss room, so at least it has more than some boss maps. Ultimately, it's a decent boss map, but it leaves something to be desired in terms of regular maps, and it could have used some optional areas and secrets. It's time to refuel in Unit 2B, Supply Station. This is another map that's more or less a circuit, though at least you do get a neat small courtyard at the beginning as an optional path to some armor. The main gimmick of this map is grabbing power cubes, shutting down sections of the supply section in the process, as well as sabotaging the train so it smashes into a wall, which is pretty nifty. The sense of scale in these maps have been quite good, and this is certainly no exception, with great big rooms full of crates and lifts to vertically traverse. Add in enforcers, gunners, and berserks, and there's definitely plenty to keep you on your toes here. Ultimately, it's another good map that I just feel is a bit too straight line for its own good. More deviating paths would be welcomed. It's time to teach Macron a lesson in Unit 10B, Final Showdown. Since the previous map was separated, this is literally just kill the boss and then head into the escape pod, not really much to speak of. Now, Macron can be a tough fight under normal circumstances since he has the Hyper Blaster, Railgun, and even the almighty BFG with its hit you with lasers as it passes by Death Ball. However, I still had a quad damage and invulnerability I never used, so I proceeded to curb stomp him with absolute ease with barely a hint of a fight, but can't blame Macron for that. One neat thing is there's an Easter egg with the dev team's portals leading to a tank with Iron Maidens cozying up to him. What a stud! The map itself leaves something to be desired for length, but thankfully Macron's a pretty engaging boss, so that kinda compensates for it. It's time to instruct a jumpstart in Unit 8E, Launch Command. Well, I'll say one nice thing about the map, it has a bit of non-linearity even if it's just deciding which of two valves you want to turn first to accomplish your mission. There's actually a pretty amusing change in the RTX version where it changes the black hole generator to look like an NVIDIA logo, which I kinda thought was a funny nod. Another fun little note is there's actually a secret behind the black hole generator that you have to rocket jump to reach, with the game actually alluding to the fact that you had to have done that. Beyond this, though, it's a pretty forgettable map that's pretty much just wandering around, activating things, and shooting things. It's a very competent map and is better than many of them, but it's certainly not ranking up there with the best of them. It's time to get a new app in Unit 1B, Installation. This map is interesting. You will not get everything from this map the first go around because it's a hub map where a chunk of it requires getting back to. With that in mind, it introduces the machine gun as well as technically the first map to have the super shotgun, sort of following Doom, whose second map introduced the chain gun. The biggest criticism I have with it is it's not quite as exploratory as the previous map, but that's not a major complaint. It does still have an optional catwalk above the starting area as well as 2 secrets. In addition to more enforcers, it also shows you how grunts might also be equipped with them to throw you off. Overall, it's a well-made map and the returning element is really cool, but it just doesn't have as much depth as I'd like. It's time to protect the goods in Unit 3E, Guardhouse. This map has what I'd consider a very acceptable amount of non-linearity in that it has a couple of bodies of water to hop into that provide optional areas. This map also introduces a charging melee enemy akin to fiends from the first Quake in the form of mutants, melee only, but you definitely don't want to let them hit you because they hurt. Another noteworthy thing is a trap with a hyper blaster, although I got through it easily just by running, so the exploding and collapsing ground into spikes never really got me even when I didn't expect it. A big area with a tank guarding the main building nicely rounds things out. All around, it's a very competent map, and I can say I overall enjoyed it. Good mix of more cramped halls and more wide areas provide good variety. It's time to thank Faster Perish in Unit 5C, Sudden Death. This is actually a first, a map that's shorter than the length of this ranking short because it is over in exactly 30 seconds. The gimmick of the secret map is that you basically have to grab as much as possible within that time limit. Spoilers, you're not going to get everything, so you'll want to prioritize what loot you want the most. I, of course, made a beeline for any ammo I could find, including a railgun, since it at least provides some slugs, which is always great for that weapon. You can also go for a quad damage, but I typically don't since I never remember to actually use the one I have. Overall, it's not technically much of a map, but it is tremendous as a bonus map. It's earned my respect in that regard, and I love the concept of it. It's time to crash this royal party in Unit 9B, Lower Palace. This is another fine example of a map that becomes more interesting based on how it interacts with other maps, both the previous and the following map. The area you reprogram the data spinner in looks like a proper entrance to a palace, which is fitting given its role on the map, and there's an interesting gun trap further ahead. I also always find the prospect of unlocking shortcut doors pretty pleasing, chalk it up to my interest in Metroidvania, so I appreciate its use here. The tank commanders continue to be a presence, but they're nothing you can't handle if you're used to tanks. Overall, I'd say this is another well-made map. It's a nice mix of spacious and cramped halls and makes excellent use of the hub system. It's time to get down with some microwaves in Unit 8B, Comm Satellite. This is actually a really cool map. It has a similar low-gravity mechanism as the Vertigo map from Quake 1, but in my opinion does the concept a lot better. The idea is that you're on a space station, so you have to be careful about falling into space and close a couple hangars to avoid just being sucked out. It also has the Hornet, and the low gravity makes it a lot more fun to fight it than the big gun it debuted in. Helps that the map is a lot more featured too. It's a relatively short map, but it manages to feel like an open one with enough places to poke around to capture my interest. Ultimately, it's a fun and brief secret map, one I'd definitely recommend seeking out as part of your Quake 2 playthroughs. It's time to scale the castle walls in Unit 9A, Outer Courts. At first glance, this map only seems like a tough straight line that introduces tougher versions of tanks as commanders, but there's more than meets the eye here. From the get-go, there's two ways to get into the next map and a return trip to get the important item, the data spinner, which I took longer than I care to admit to find in the RTX version. It's this kind of interaction with other maps that Quake 2 didn't have enough of, and I like how it takes advantage of Quake 2's hub nature. The courtyard fight at the beginning was also fairly challenging, which is fitting for getting this far into the game. Ultimately, this is a very nice map that can look deceptively simple, but peel back its layers and you see it has more than plenty of depth. It's time to chase after a demented Floridian priest in Unit 3B, Detention Center. This is another repeat map, and that you need to come back with a red key to actually complete it fully, so I'm taking that part into account. It also has a couple of interesting secrets like a system of doors and cages as well as a moat with some armor in it to encourage you to take a swim. It also introduces a new enemy in the form of a medic, hyper blaster, and the archvile ability to revive enemies, better giblet corpses. It's also visually interesting, showcasing the horror of the Strogs with suffering prisoners who seem desperate for any way to end their pain. As a whole, it's another very competent map that's both interesting to play through and does a surprising lot to show you how horrifying the Strog can be with the captured. It's time to put it to voicemail in Unit 1C, Comm Base. While this map introduces a number of enemies, namely the Parasite, Gunner, and Flyer, with the Gunner being the tougher one and the others more annoyances. For criticism, this may be the most straightforward map, though that's not to say it isn't without a little depth, like a radioactive pit with an instant boost health and an envirosuit to get back out safely. It's the first map to use keycards for what that's worth, and connecting it to the objective with the satellite was pretty neat, but that's mostly story fluff. Introducing Quake 2's quad damage was also pretty fun, since unlike Quake 1's variant, it's activate wherever you need it, albeit limited to one. Overall, it's a decent map that raises the tensions and at least has a secret exit, so that's pretty nice to have. It's time to park your jets into Unit 8A, Outer Hangar. This map is fairly small, but actually a lot more involved than it may seem at first glance, given the moat below just past start. Not only does that provide a good amount of content by itself, but destroying the circuit to a fan grants access to a nice big secret area leading into a secret map on top of the normal path. I actually really like this. It shows there's more to this map than meets the eye and encourages you to explore around, or you can just go straight for the normal exit. Exploration is the name of the game here, even if the map itself isn't the biggest in the world. Ultimately, I'd say it's a very good map just because the optional areas and the aesthetic and sense of scale aren't too shabby either. It's time to storm on into Unit 3A main gate. If you think you know what I'm going to say, you're wrong, because this map actually has an optional area that even provides another path, so I'm actually pleasantly surprised. Other upsides of the map are introducing the dangerous and fast gladiator, pelting you with railgun blasts, and having a laser grid trap you have to jump over. Even what looks like a point of no return isn't actually, because not only do you have that alternate path, but there's a straight up button you can find to turn the lasers off again. Another interesting thing is a Strog on a turning rocket turret. It's only a shame you can't give it a spin for yourself. Overall, it's a very refreshing map that feels like you're entering a heavily fortified location that for once isn't a straight line. It's time to break into the Strog hellscape in Unit 1A, Outer Base. I must say, this is a very well done starter map. I'd even honestly compare it in some ways to Doom Z1M1 Hangar. Much like that, it seems deceptively straight line, but with a promise of some great outdoors and other paths that can provide more things, including a shotgun, armor, and hand grenades should you look. Given that there are enforcers guarding the exit, you maybe want that shotgun unless you plan to use your little pea shooter to take them down, which isn't highly recommended. It makes good use of some Quake 2 mechanics like destructible floors and swimming and layers of the environment. Ultimately, it very much succeeds as a starter map from the war-torn aesthetics with jets flying overhead to the exploration potential. Very promising beginning. It's time to discover the Forgotten in Unit 1D, Lost Station. The two main gimmicks of this map are having something to ride around on and the earliest access to the super shotgun, deemed the powerful weapon by the objective. Perhaps befitting of the map's secret nature, you have to find secrets to sort of beat it, albeit the obvious shootable switches, so it's not like it's obscure or anything. There's actually a surprising amount of depth to the map, especially in terms of exploration, where bodies of water along the ride provide some room for exploration. Enemies leading back to the lift also make a great opportunity to try out that super shotgun. Overall, I'd say it's one of the best secret maps I've played in one of these classic first-person shooters. It's time for Bitterman's exit interview in this overview. Taken as a whole, Quake 2 is a fairly fun shooter with some fun additions like a persist inventory, a hub map system, and the almighty railgun. Where it falls short to me is in its theming, which I feel isn't nearly as creative and out there as Doom or even Quake 1. The Strog are very much Star Trek Borg, but less interesting. At its worst, a lot of the maps also feel like absolute straight lines with very little deviation, save for a secret here and there. However, when it hits its stride and is making good use of the hub system and exploration, it can hang up there with the best of them to me. Taken as a whole, I'd still say Quake 2 is pretty fun to play, and the RTX version, other than one or two quirks, nicely elevates the appearance of the game. Despite a dip in style, I'd still recommend playing through it for some more FPS fun.